Hi, welcome to Here to There, hosted by Carolyn Taketa, former attorney, current small groups pastor, and life coach. Through monthly conversations with pastors, authors, and guests, we hope to stir your thoughts and encourage you to move from where you are to where you want to be, in your personal life, in your leadership, or in your ministry.
Well, we have a special broadcast taped today from the Small Group Network Lobby Gathering in March, where our guest, Carl George, was a keynote speaker. And it was such a great opportunity to sit down with Carl and talk about the future of small groups ministry and what he sees, and kind of maybe make some predictions or just give us his assessment about what he sees in the ministry world of groups. And so for those of you who do not know Carl George, and maybe a handful of people who haven't heard, he's an internationally recognized church consultant. He's helped congregations and leaders in over 100 denominations all over the world to increase their effectiveness. He's an experienced pastor and the Church Growth Institute director and the author of many books. In fact, how many books have you written, Carl? Do you know? Half a dozen books. And he's guided small group ministry design. He's one of the pioneers of the small groups ministry in Northern California, Northern America, as well as California. And so he's been so influential, and we've had him as a friend of the Small Group Network. And I know you've mentored Steve Bladen, who's one of our founders. And so thank you so much for making the time to sit down with us and share some of your thoughts.
I'm glad to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, so you've been around small groups ministry for decades.
Yes.
50 years?
Since the 1960s.
Okay, so you've seen a lot of trends come and go.
I was a pastor in a new church that we had organized in Gainesville, Florida, in the 1960s. And we reached a point where we felt like small groups was the thing to do. It was Lyman Coleman.
Oh, another pioneer of small groups movement.
He was his material on small groups, especially for youth, and his excellence in creating materials, mostly icebreakers in games of this kind, really set us on the path toward understanding and using small groups. And as I was in the church there in Florida, we were developing in a number of different ways, not all of which we understood, but the church was growing. We had a Christian school and a church, and we'd captured the headlines. The newspaper in the area had gotten fascinated with us and what we were doing, and so we were growing. But I was increasingly aware of challenges and problems that I didn't know quite how to deal with, and they had to do with something social that I couldn't put my finger on, having to do with who can you get to grow with whom most beneficially. So we finally reached a point where I knew we were in crisis mode. I'd been receiving some mailings from Lyman Coleman, some of the experimental work he was doing at the very beginning of his small group life. And I hadn't met the Faith at Work people at all, Bruce Larson and that bunch out from the West Coast. But one day I tried to get my parishioners to share prayer requests with one another. And because I thought that would be a great thing to do. So I had everybody on their feet, and they were all greeting each other and talking to each other the way you do in what people do when they pass the peace in a congregation. They're just chatting with each other, trying to make them feel at ease. And as asking them for an exchange of prayer requests and concerns so they could pray for one another. I looked down on the front row and realized that what I had done was I had placed two very unlike people into this assignment. One of which was a blue blood doctor, dentist's wife, whose assignment for the week was to redecorate their family room for a special tea that her husband's friends wanted in their golf course home. A lovely, beautiful, talented.
So specific, but okay.
Very specific lady, but I mean, an elegant person and a wonderful Christian and so forth. And sitting next to her was another person who was also a sincere believer, but was a very, very humble person who had children who were marginal in terms of their talents and mental abilities, who worked as a minimum wage worker at a state-run home for the handicapped, mentally handicapped people, and who walked to work. They were so
Okay.
impoverished. And her main challenge each day was to get home after the children got home, before her live-in spouse got home, because she didn't want him molesting the children. So,
Oh, wow.
so on the one hand, we have
Wow.
the elegant in our society
And the privilege, yeah.
and privileged, and on the other hand, we have a woman who is barely hanging on to
Yes.
sanity,
Yes.
struggling against odds for which she did not have the means or the resources or the tools. And I had just put them together, telling them that they should be sharing their prayer requests. One is trying to stay within a $20 a yard budget for installing a carpet in a room that already was carpeted, and the other one doesn't even have
Yes.
the means to
Sure.
get to her home from her work.
Yes.
And the miles between them was so great. And I went home that night saying, "Dear Lord, there has got to be a way to bring people together in such a way that they're not mystified by the existence of each other." Now, there are people who celebrate this diversity across this wide gap, but I have enough knowledge of how people behave toward each other to know that was just a really bad idea on my part to try to mix those two types of people. And I sat down and I said, "God, there has got to be a better way. We have got to allow people to group and cluster in such a way that they're at least within reach of each other in there." And I prayed, and I put pencil to paper, and I struggled, and I said, I don't know how to do this. I've never seen this done. And then it occurred to me that if I would select a range of personalities from across our congregation and ask them to accept leadership responsibility for home groups, each one could have a home group that they would gather together, and those people would be close enough to one another that they could have a one another life, living together, life together.
Right. So this part of this is when you came up with the 9 keys?
Well,
book?
the 9 keys was the end of all that. If I'd had the 9 keys to begin with, it would have been easy.
You wouldn't have.
But we were struggling. So I said, how do we sort this thing out? And I'm praying. And I remember that from my youth camp days, I had figured out how to get social types that were compatible together. I had driven a busload of kids to camp when I was a youth pastor, and I was also a camp director for our state association. And so I had each summer from all over our state, busloads of kids would come together and we would organize them in our summer camps. But one day I got into a problem where I had a busload of children, and I had the bus driver and myself were the only adults. Everybody else welched in the last hour. Normally, we line up and all the volunteers are there. And when we got to the end of the day, we had a busload of kids. We were meeting a whole state full of kids, and we had no adults. And in those days, I didn't know enough to call for help or to cancel the dent or anything else. We just went ahead. And I prayed the whole way to camp, saying, "Dear Lord, what am I going to do?" Well, when I got to camp, I devised a system where I laid out the natural leaders in the camp, the kids that I knew could lead, and I assigned one of them as a cabin leader. And I put their names at the head of a piece of paper, and I laid them all out on a long. And I told the kids to go sign up under the leader that they wanted to sign up under.
Wow,
and so the kids did it. And I only had one question about it. And there was one girl that I questioned her, but I said, no, she's not spiritually mature enough. I don't want to trust her. I don't want to honor her. She's trouble. But I'll put all the other natural leaders I put down. And so we staffed the camp with kids. And the others signed up under them. And it worked beautifully. Everybody still, until Thursday morning when chapel time came and one cabin was missing. And the cabin that was missing contained a girl who had strong leadership skills but was truly non-spiritual.
Oh, wow, okay.
And she had led her cabin in their nightgowns out into the swamp. Snakes and all, alligators and all, led them out into the swamp to a dredging area where muck had been brought up and piled. And they slipped and slid, and they were covered with black mud from head to toe, giggling and screaming and having fun. And we finally retrieved them and brought them down. And I said to her, "What have you done?" And she looked at me defiantly, and she said, "You didn't trust me with leadership, did you?" And I thought, oh. And then I learned that leadership has strength, and we better tap it in some way.
Otherwise, it's going to come back and bite you.
It's going to demonstrate itself. And I said to her, no, that's a mistake I'm not going to make again. You're a leader now. Let's go. And I couldn't discipline her. I couldn't send them home. There was no facilities for doing so. So I promoted her. And she fell in line, and she grew more spiritually in that next 2 days than she had all week or that I'd seen her do for a year. But the fact that those kids lined up, they self-aligned to leaders. Yes. And the leaders accepted empowerment because they knew who they were. So I sat down and decided, I've got to do this for my whole church. And so I laid out the dozen people in the church. In those days, I conceived basically of the men doing that, but I named 12 men. I got up and preached a sermon the following week. And this just shows you how God helps people who don't have enough sense to help themselves. But I got up a sermon, and I said, this is what I believe that the Lord is calling us to do and to ask you to do. And if you're willing to accept training for being a small group leader, will you please come forward? The men that I had on that piece of paper, to a man, came to the front.
Oh, wow.
And allowed me to pray for them and commission them. And then from that point on, I met with them on a Wednesday night and trained them in small group process. And they turned around and led their small group. And it was the most amazing peace that came to that church. And I only had one family that did not fall within that process.
Wow.
One family. And I asked everybody in the church, all the families in the church, to name who they would like to meet with in the same way kind of I did at camp with the sign-up sheets. Yes. And everybody named, it all worked except for one family, yeah. And I said, well, no, that won't work. Well, I'll put them over here, I said to myself. And they're the only family that didn't stick. They came to me and said, this isn't going to work for us. We have to go so-and-so. So I moved, and I thought, people really do pick out who they're willing to follow. And they're willing to work with.
Well, that's interesting. Here's a side note, but a lot of our processes, we place people.
We try to.
Yeah, we try to. And I know some people have a hybrid where you can select online or, we have all these methods. But at the end of the day, there is something to be said for chemistry. And how just God somehow knits groups together. Sometimes the leader's not even all that great, but somehow the group gels in like a remarkable way. And other times, I think these people should all love each other, and they just don't ever gel. There's something to that process that it's really not about what we do and control.
I believe that personal preference and God are both involved in that mixture. Yeah. And if we can figure out ways, and that led us to speed dating for selecting small groups.
Yes, we did that for a while too, back in the 80s.
All kinds of ways. But the key is you have to find some way of getting people that will have a chemistry with one another so that they want to learn together and so they want to pray together. And if you can figure out what that is, and you have to keep experimenting in some cases until you can find it. But
what about people that are just difficult, that are not just, nobody wants necessarily to have them in their group because there's so much work, or they're needy, or they're just socially awkward?
Yes, there are. There are people who are really requiring of extra care. Yes, there are.
And we're as a church, we're called to care for them.
Yeah, we're called to care for them, but what we don't understand is they recognize that they need care and even demand it. But we are reluctant to provide the degree of direction that they need. Sometimes we say, well, no, I really shouldn't be telling them what to do or whatever. But if you don't, then the group will literally destruct.
Yes.
It will come apart. I remember one special problem. They had a woman in a church. It was a middle-class church, and one woman would show up for the meetings, and she had terrible hygiene. Her body odor was just unbearable, and you couldn't stay in the room with her. The people couldn't, and they were so polite, and they were trying to figure out nice ways to hint and ask about how the plumbing of her house was working and all this indirect stuff. And I said, they came to me and they said, what do we do? It's going to destroy our group because if she's there, we're just miserable. I said, well, you've got to tell her to take a bath. Well, we can't do that.
Because it seems so rude to say that.
It seems so impolite.
Yeah.
And I said, do you think that she's aware of her problem? It's entirely possible that she cannot smell. She smells because she cannot smell.
Right.
And I said, why don't you take her aside, take one of you and take her aside and say, here's what we must do. We need for you to do this. And shepherd her.
Did they do it?
Reparent her. That was the only way they saved the group, yes.
They did.
But the reality was they had to overcome their own conditioning, their own social conditioning as to what was polite and acceptable. Yes. And other people require more direction. There are people who cannot keep their mouth shut in groups, and you have to, as a group leader, take them aside and say, I really need your help in managing this group. And what I need most of all for you to do is to limit the amount of time you speak during the group time. And I need to give you a hint. So I want you to sit next to me, and when I tap you on the knee, I want you to know that's enough now, and you need to be quiet and listen to the others. And you say, why would we ever do that? That would be so embarrassing to me. Yes, but if you don't, they won't have a place, and their sense of insecurity is going to be increased because nobody's going to be around them and withdraw from them. Right. You say, but can I take that kind of an assertive step? Well, as a group leader, you must, if you want to have an effective a group.
I mean, see, some of the stuff doesn't change. That was true, back in the 60s. It's so that kind of stuff. And if anything, I think we've gotten better maybe about some of the skill side to it. And small groups are more popular now than they've ever been, it appears. I mean, that's kind of the trends we're seeing. Do you notice that, Carl, that it seems to be churches are more and more buying in across denominations, even across the world, to small groups ministry as being a vital part of doing life and community?
Look at the big trends, okay? The very big trends. Now, in America, our memory of history and trends is not very long.
True. Okay? We're a young country.
A young country, and we've had successful Sunday schools that have led us to understanding the benefit of grouping people in smaller groups. And now we're having successful small groups. And there are some denominations who have declared our Sunday schools, in fact, are small groups.
Yes, they converted them.
They're on-premises small groups.
Yes.
They've relabeled.
This is so true, yes. They have relabeled.
Sunday school. But the truth is, those Sunday school groups and classes, many of them functioned in a small group manner.
In a relational way, yes.
A very relational way. And so that was advantageous. But see, what we don't seem to remember is that before the Sunday school, as dominated by Southern Baptists, who have the largest denomination that does this kind of thing. Before that, there were the Methodists. Okay, the Methodists had what Baptists called cottage prayer meetings. The Methodists called them circles, and they would meet in small groups, following the pattern of John Wesley in England prior to that. All right, many of these small groups, the Methodist small groups, you would call them charismatic prayer circles. But as Methodism fell to apostasy and to modernism, then the most visible survivor of that era were the Southern Baptist Sunday schools.
Okay.
But the Sunday schools became calcified over time, and they limited, the close grading system limited a church to about 1,000 people if you followed the close grading system to its apex. And so the small group movement came along and operated in contradiction and in competition with the Sunday schools until the pastors began to get the word that the Sunday school was a small group. And then they said, okay, well, we do have. And so they buried the hatchet. It was a clash of methods, but the essence of it was life together.
Yes.
And getting in a place where we can talk frankly to one another. But if you take the bigger picture, go back to Wesley. Well, where did the Wesleyan tradition thrive and persist? Okay, it thrived in the Sunday school movement, and it thrived in the American scene in the Methodist Church and then in the Baptist Church, from which all the other churches kind of took their cue. But there's something more going on. Cho, Korean, Seoul,
the cell group.
60s, the cell group system. Cho said that his heroes were Luther and Wesley. And he insisted that his inspiration for justifying the cell system came from Wesley. Now, if there's some footnotes on the Cho story, it's not entirely John Wesley. John Wesley gets intellectual credit for it, but Cho's mother-in-law actually probably is a bigger part of all that.
Mother-in-law does not get the credit.
Well, she does. She gets the credit in another way, but not in a way that you'd explain. You see, the cell system in the Cho Church, as I understand the genesis of it, really began in response to Cho's own physical weakness when he was sick and could not minister. He took his church to 10,000 people or something, and basically burned out physically, just collapsed physically. And so while he's collapsed, his mother-in-law keeps the thing going by means of commissioning these small group leaders. And here's the genius of Cho. He recognized that what she had done and was doing was worthwhile and could be multiplied across the range of people that he was touching. And so when he got back to being well, he didn't cancel what she did. He amplified it, and he took it from there. And during the 60s and 70s, we watched that church grow to hundreds of thousands of people based on tens of thousands of small group leaders that he then sent staff to support in the field. And it was amazing what they would do. Those people would go, he'd hire a pastor to be a small group encourager, and that pastor would have 50 groups to look out for, and he or she would go out into the field 8 or 10 hours a day. They'd meet at church for prayer and for morning devotions, and then they'd leave mid-morning, and they were out till dark, and going alongside of those small group leaders out in the field, praying with them and helping them. And they didn't attend many of the small group meetings, as I understand it, but they certainly were in touch, hand-holding the various small group leaders wherever they were found. And that model for encouraging small group leaders still persists in effective places, where you have someone who looks out for a small group leader is not left to himself or herself.
And the network is so bought into that idea, and that's the whole idea, is that you have to keep equipping the leaders and pouring into them so that they can pour into their people.
That's exactly right.
So that piece hasn't changed.
But take it a step further. Let's take an even bigger look.
Okay.
Instead of going from Wesley to Cho,
okay,
go from the early church with no worship facilities, home-based house churches, and follow that all the way to what looks like the next emergence of the small group movement and the church. Okay. We'll talk about the past. How did for 3 centuries, while operating under waves of persecution that were seriously persecuting, I mean, like killing. There are 10 waves of documented Roman Empire attacks on Christians that resulted in tens of thousands of Christians being murdered for their faith. All right. Go from there down to what's happened in China in terms of the viral nature of the house church in China, accompanied by miracles, more than many of us are comfortable with or have been comfortable with. But the story of the Chinese house church is a church under persecution by its government, where people who have faith, filled with the Holy Spirit, travel from their places of business to a neighboring village, find a sick person, pray for them, see them physically healed. The family gets converted around that. A small gathering comes around that. Another house church is formed. From that house church, people go to and it becomes a viral thing that you can't account for unless you have some awareness of the Holy Spirit's work and some awareness that you don't have to have an institutional steeple and church and bell in order to have vital Christianity. All right. So what's happened in China is kind of being rebirthed worldwide as I'm watching it. I came across a fellow who had been to a place off of China, and in 20 years' time, the absence of a Christian witness was transformed into several 100,000 Christians based on a kind of a house church model where there were no ordained clergy, there were no training schools, in the fashion that you and I would say a credential degree and so forth. They saw this enormous multiplication of the church over a period of time. And that kind of viral church planting is now coming on again all over the world. Recently, I was with Stephen Lutz from Ladysmith, South Africa, a Baptist pastor, Afrikaner, converted in the Dutch church, but became a pastor ordained by the Baptists. And between 1997 or so and about 2007, he worked out a way of combining evangelistic efforts with the training of small group leaders or pastors, and they put in place a couple of hundred small churches, home groups. and the leaders, the pastors of those churches, are laymen. I mean, it's all bivocational. Nobody's paid per se, and they don't have buildings. They don't have budgets for brick and mortar, but they do have a commission to share their faith with others. And then when those others are gathered together, to make sure that a pastor undergoes training within that context of that group. And so the movement is a movement of pastoral networking, if you please, along with the commission for each group to multiply itself through new converts. All right, by the time he got to 2009 or so, they were in 4 countries and had about 300 churches of this viral kind. All right. Today they have more than 50,000 churches. Wow. They're operating in 30 countries, and their materials have been translated into 32 different languages. And the materials are pastor training materials.
That's amazing.
It's as we sit here, as you and I sit here today, they'll organize another several churches. And,
so what am I doing with my life, really?
Well, that's
amazing.
I look at what they have done and are doing.
Yeah.
And I say, well, why haven't we heard about it? Well, America's kind of last. We're getting in on this late. And he's just come to this country in the last year to start.
Do you think that would work here?
What?
Do you think it would work in the U.S.?
It is working. It's working in dozens, if not now hundreds of places in this country. And it's the next move of Christian faith beyond brick and mortar churches and beyond the branch churches that you and I are more familiar with, or the mega churches. These are going to be networks of micro churches as opposed to mega churches or branch churches. And what I'm watching is based on basically 2 things: evangelism and the training of the pastoral leader to be able to teach the word. And those 2 fundamentals, reaching new people with the gospel, gathering them together, and making sure they have a leader that is being continually trained. That's where the future of the small group is going to be.
What do you think we in the brick and mortar churches, and most of our listeners are in, what could we learn from that, or how can we be part of that kind of viral movement?
Yeah, how can we? Well, that's a good question. Don't oppose it, for one thing. Okay, yes. Recognize it for what it is.
Sure.
It's not us.
Well, it's a movement of the Holy Spirit. It's clearly...
The idea that the Holy Spirit's going to get to run the church instead of us.
It's so radical.
What a concept. Wouldn't it be amazing if
So how do we get out of the way? How can we partner or help?
Well, I think by not opposing it would be the first step. By recognizing the fact that you don't have to have a brick and mortar existence. But see, that's very threatening. You bring that into a big box church that depends, its finances are dependent on people seeing them as the storehouse to which God...
The goods and services flow through.
Yeah, to recognize the fact that God might want a direct delivery system is something else. And there will be networks of such churches, and those networks will be small group leader / lay pastor led communities. And they will take all kinds of forms and then be in all kinds of places. And the big concern is going to be, well, can they avoid heresy? Well, we can't avoid heresy in the mainline churches. I mean, all of our seminaries have fallen apart and are untrustworthy. So the argument against heresy is a silly one. But I started questioning the fellows who'd come in, Curtis Sargent, some of the others come in from overseas. And I said, how do you keep orthodoxy going in these churches, And they said, it's amazing, but because people are pointed back to the Bible constantly, they may get a little bit off track, but they don't stay off track very long. They get back because the Bible will carry them back to where they need to be.
Again, the Holy Spirit is remarkable. Speaking through His Word.
If you keep insisting the Holy Spirit has to be involved in the growth of a church, you're going to sound just like those New Testament guys running around saying there's no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved and things like that.
But that's so exciting that God would just use that. And small groups, I guess when I look at small groups ministry, it's so adaptable. Because the principles are so adaptable, whether it's a church of, 50, whether it's a micro church, whether it's, a big mega church, it really is so adaptable because it's about relationships at the end of the day.
The idea of allowing people to come together, to do their life together, to pray together, to study the Bible together, to raise their kids together. Those are amazingly good ideas.
Because they're from the Bible. Okay, we're back to Acts 2.
The whole history of the church.
Yes.
I mean, from the first century until now, what we're seeing is a return to the first century form of church, and it will endure past the persecutions to come.
That's a good word. Gives us hope.
It gives us hope, and it also humbles us a bit to realize that God's in the business and He's much smarter and better at it than we are.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Carl, for your time. God bless you and your ministry.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. And please feel free to engage as you listen to this podcast on our Facebook group or any of our other social networks. And we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.